The horseshoes spoke first. Boyd McElveen kept his finished shoes on a rod along the north wall of the forge, 40 or 50 of them at a time, hung open-end down the way his teacher had hung them before him. On the last night of August 1886, a few minutes before 10 o'clock, those shoes began to ring against one another. A small, bright, senseless chiming, like a church bell heard from 3 counties off. Boyd was banking his fire for the night. He stood still with the rake in his hand and looked at the wall, and the wall looked back at him, and the chiming did not stop. Then the water in the slack tub wrinkled. Not from wind. There was no wind. The surface of that black water folded into rings that ran from the edges toward the middle, which is the wrong direction for rings to run, and Boyd McElveen, 57 years old, had just enough time to say his grandson's name before the ground under Ashby County picked itself up and moved. What came out of the earth that night had no name yet in Lebanon. It threw men from their beds 22 miles up the road from Charleston. It rang the bell in the Baptist steeple with nobody on the rope. It ran under the pine flats like a wagon under a rug, and when it had passed, and it passed twice more before midnight, every brick building on the 4 streets of Lebanon stood cracked open in the moonlight, and the people stood out in their yards in their night clothes and would not go back inside. By morning the town knew 2 things. Nobody had died in Lebanon, and nobody could say what a cracked house was worth, because nobody had ever needed to know. Within a month, the county would decide those houses were worth nothing at all. Salvage men would come up from the city with crowbars and offer $4 a thousand for the brick. And one man, a man who had never laid a brick in his life, a man the town trusted with wagon tires and plow points, and nothing above the height of a horse, would stand in front of a widow's cracked gable wall and make the strangest claim anybody in Ashby County had ever heard a blacksmith make. He said he could sew it shut with iron. This is a story about the trade the sea taught, the county that laughed at it, and the morning the ground asked its question a second time. If stories of forgotten trades and stubborn hands are the kind you stay for, take a moment and subscribe. It tells us to keep bringing them now, to understand what Boyd McElveen did in the 90 days that followed, and why he was the one man in the county who was not surprised by any of it. You have to leave Lebanon altogether. You have to go down to the water. In 1843, a boy of 14 was put on a wagon in the Pine Flats and sent down to Charleston to be bound apprentice to a shipsmith named Christoph Hess. Hess was a Hanover German with a shop 2 streets off the wharves, and what he made was not horseshoes. He made the iron that holds a wooden ship together, the through bolts and the drifts, the chain plates that anchor the rigging, the iron knees that brace deck to hull, the long strapping that runs diagonal under the planking of a hard-driven hull like tendons under skin. 7 years Boyd served him, and the first lesson came the first week, when the boy asked why a ship wanted so much more iron than a barn. Hess took him down to the wharf and made him stand and watch a loaded brig come in past the bar with a sea running behind her. "Watch her," he said. "She is being picked up and set down, her whole length every few seconds. Her bow is climbing while her stern is falling. Everything in her is trying to leave everything else. A barn," Hess said, "stands still all its life. A ship is a barn in an earthquake that never ends. She lives because she is sewn." That was the word the old German used, sewn. Every through bolt was a stitch, driven clear through keel and timber, headed over a ring on the far side, so that the 2 pieces did not merely touch, but were fastened into one piece that could flex and come back. Wood is strong when you press on it, and weak when you pull it apart, Hess taught, and the sea does nothing but pull things apart, so you give the pulling to the iron. Iron is happiest when something is trying to pull it in two. All day, every day, in a working hull, the wood carries the pressing and the iron carries the pulling, and that division of labor is the whole reason men cross oceans in bundles of pine boards and live. Boyd McElveen finished his time in 1850, and there was no shipsmithing in the Pine Flats, so he came home to Lebanon, took over a Crossroads forge in 1852, and spent 34 years being exactly as much blacksmith as a farm county wanted. Tires and points, trace chains and door hinges, 50 horseshoes on a rod along the north wall. If he was more than that, the county had never had a reason to ask, and Boyd was not a man who volunteered. The reason arrived at 9:51 on the night of August 31, 1886, and it arrived for everybody at once. The papers would spend that autumn trying to teach the country what had happened. The shock that broke Charleston was felt from Boston to Chicago. Men wrote letters about swaying lamps across 2 million square miles of the United States. But the center of it, the ground that took the blow directly, was not the city. It was the pine and farm country northwest of it, the tract around Somerville, and Lebanon sat inside that country like a nail under the hammer. In the low fields south of town, the earth split and threw up cones of white sand a man could not jump across, each one with a little crater in its crown, as if the ground had briefly learned to boil. On the railroad 2 miles east, section men found the rails pushed into long S-curves, still spiked to their ties, bent the way a child bends wire. And in town, the brick told on itself. Lebanon's 4 streets held 11 brick buildings and part of a 12th, and there was a reason the number was that small. Wood was cheap in the pine flats. Brick was pride. A brick store, a brick bank, a brick house. That was a man saying out loud that he had arrived and intended to stay. On the first morning of September, all that pride stood in the sun with its seams opened. Chimneys were down all over the county, down through kitchen roofs, down across porches, lying in the yards like shot birds. Gable ends had fallen outward into side lots in a single piece, so that a house stood with one whole wall gone and its upstairs bedroom open to the weather, like a doll's house, the bed still made. And on the walls that stood, the cracks ran in a pattern a man could not stop seeing once he had seen it. Great ragged X's, corner to corner, as if the earth had come through in the night, and marked which buildings it meant to come back for. Boyd walked those 4 streets on the first morning with Asa, his son's boy, 15 that summer, and bound to the forge, the way Boyd had once been bound to Hess. Asa carried the chalk and the book. Boyd looked. He looked the way no one else in Lebanon was looking, because everyone else was looking at what had fallen. And Boyd could not take his eyes off what had almost fallen. At the Pruitt house, he stood in the side yard a full quarter hour, reading the gable. The crack came down from the peak in 2 long strokes, and the wall below it had moved. You could see it if you sighted along the plane of the brick. The top of that wall now stood the width of 2 fingers farther out than the bottom, and it had not been built that way. The wall was not broken so much as it was leaving. It had started a journey of 11 feet, out and down into the side yard, and had gone 2 inches of it, and was resting. It's still going, Asa said. He had sighted the wall too. The boy had good eyes. Everything that heavy is always going, Boyd said. Job of a wall is to go slow. That one's quit going slow. What he did not say, because he was still working it out himself, was what his hands had already decided. His hands had spent 7 years learning what to do about a thing whose parts were trying to leave each other. And standing in Ori Pruitt's side yard, both of them itched. The county, meanwhile, was reaching its own verdict, and reaching it fast. And the verdict was the one the title of this story already told you. Cracked brick was dead brick. Every man in Ashby County had heard it from his father as settled law. A crack in a wall is like a crack in a churn. You can look at it, you can cuss it, but you cannot ask it to hold anything ever again. A mason from Charleston came through in the 2nd week of September, walked the 4 streets in an hour, and said the honest thing and the useless thing, which were the same thing. Tear down to the crack and lay it back up. At $9 a thousand laid, plus new brick, in a county where the bank itself was cracked and cash was frightened. He got no work and went home. Behind him came the other kind of city men, the salvage crews, who offered $4 a thousand for sound-used brick and would do the tearing down themselves. And to a man staring at a wall he had been told 100 times could never be trusted again, $4 a thousand began to sound like the last boat leaving. Ori Pruitt was 63, a widow 11 years, and her house was her whole estate. Dandridge Pruitt had been a brick mason. He had molded and burned the brick for that house himself in 1858, in a clamp kiln down by the creek, and like most home-burned country brick it was soft, sand-struck, under-fired at the edges of the clamp, the kind of brick you could scratch with a horseshoe nail. The house was his monument and her roof, and the crack ran through both. When the salvage man worked her price out for her, on the back of an envelope, house and both chimneys, $61, she to keep the lumber, she did not cry. Town accounts agree on that. She thanked him, went inside, and sat down in the room under the leaving wall, which was perhaps her own way of saying what she thought of the offer. Boyd came the next evening after supper, with Asa and a handcart, and asked her permission to say something foolish. What he proposed, standing in the side yard while the light went, was this. He would forge 2 iron rods, each better than an inch thick and long enough to pass clear through the house from the cracked south gable to the sound north one. They would run under the attic floor, through holes bored in both walls. On each end, outside the brick, each rod would take a heavy iron plate, a washer he called it that first evening, the size of a dinner plate, and behind the plate a threaded nut, or a forged head keyed over a wedge, and then gently, over days, he would draw the rods up. The south wall could not be asked to stand on its own anymore. Very well, nobody would ask it to. It would be fastened to its sister wall across the house, through the body of the house, and the two would hold each other, the way the two sides of a ship's hull hold each other, and the pulling, the load the brick could not carry, would live in the iron which wanted it. "You mean to run a bolt through my whole house," Ori said. "Yes, ma'am, like a ship, like a ship." She looked at the wall a while. "Dandridge burned that brick with his own hands," she said. "I'd rather it stood wrong than fell right. Do your foolishness." He would not take her money, and she had none, so they settled it in the country way. Dinner for him and the boy every forging day, and her late husband's brick tools to hang in the forge. By the middle of September, half of Leadenham had found a reason to walk past the Pruitt place, because Boyd had the first rod out of the fire, and you could see it laid across 2 sawbucks in the yard, 11 feet of 1.125 iron, welded up from wagon tire stock in 3 heats, and it looked like exactly what it was, which was a thing no one had ever seen before. The naming happened at Talon's store, and like most naming it took under a minute. Verd Talon kept the porch where the county's opinions were manufactured, and when the talk came around to what the blacksmith was up to, Talon leaned back and delivered the line he had plainly been saving all day. "Boyd's gone into ladies' wear," he said. "He's lacing a corset on the Pruitt house. Cinch her in nice and tight so she dies pretty. It got the laugh he built it for, and it stuck the way only a mean, accurate word can stick. A corset. Iron stays and lacing on a body past help." Within a week, nobody in Ashby County said tie rod, including the men who had never heard the words tie rod. The Pruitt house was wearing Boyd's corset, and men asked Asa at the store, straight-faced, whether his granddaddy took waist measurements. And one of the salvage men, the one called Grier, stood a while watching Boyd dress a plate and said, not unkindly, that in Charleston they were bolting cracked buildings too, some of them, and that his crew would still be offering $4 a thousand in the spring after the first hard blow of winter finished what the corsets started. Boyd let the county laugh, because he was busy learning that the county was almost right. The first failure came on the 22nd of September, and it was his own hand's fault, and it happened in front of 6 spectators, which is the way of first failures. The rod was through the house, plate seated, and Boyd was drawing the south nut. A slow turn, a listen, a slow turn, when the iron gave a crack like a dropped plank and went dead in the wrench. The rod had parted. It had parted. He found when they drew it out, exactly where he had cut the thread. And when he looked at the break in good light, he knew it before Asa asked. Wrought iron is a bundle, not a block. It is made of fibers, like hickory, from the way it is worked up out of the puddling furnace, and a cut thread smevers those fibers where they lie. He had made the rod strongest in its body, and weakest at the one place all the strain gathered, and then he had stood there and gathered it. Hess would have taken the wrench out of his hand at the first turn. On a ship's bolt, the smith upset the end first, heated it and bumped it back on itself, swelling it fat, and cut the thread inside the swelling, so that the thinnest part of the thread was still thicker than the rod. Boyd had known that for 40 years, the way a man knows a hymn he hasn't sung since he was young. The ground had given him back his trade, and he had come to it rusty. He walked past the porch at Talon's that evening on purpose, so they could have it over with. Busted her corset string, Talon reported to the street, delighted, and the street was delighted too. The second failure was not his, and it taught the bigger lesson. On the 27th of September, the ground moved again, a short, hard jolt in the forenoon, one of the dozens of aftershocks that kept that country flinching all autumn, strong enough to set the horseshoes chiming and drop 100 loosened chimney bricks all over the county. Boyd was at the forge. He had the Pruitt house drawn up again by then on the new upset-end rods, and his first thought was for it, and the Pruitt gable came through without a fresh crack, which he did not yet allow himself to count as proof of anything. It was the Sowell house, the second house he had rodded, that failed. Marsh Sowell's brick was soft clamp brick like Pruitt's, and Boyd had seated the rod ends on plain square plates a palm across, ship practice sized for oak. When the jolt hit, the north plate did not let go and did not break. It did something worse. It pulled forward, whole, into the wall, punched itself a half-inch deep into that soft brick like a boot heel into March ground, and above it a new crack opened and ran 4 feet up the wall he had promised to save. Boyd stood in front of that punched plate for a long time, and Asa, who was learning when to be quiet, was quiet. Iron was happy, Boyd said at last. Rod held, plate held, brick quit. He put his thumb in the crushed seat, feeling the loose sand of it. Oak pushes back, boy. This stuff won't. Same pull, spread thin, or she cuts through like a wire through cheese. I sewed him a fine, strong button onto rotten cloth. The answer was already forming while he said it, and the answer was size. If soft brick could only push back a little at any one spot, then the plate had to lean on many spots. Had to spread one rod's pull across a yard of wall instead of a palm of it. That evening he drew it in chalk on the forge floor for Asa. Not a little square washer, but a great spread plate near a foot across, ribbed on the back to keep it stiff, its arms reaching out to catch the wall wide. He drew it round first, then crossed, then, because a crossed plate wastes no iron on corners that carry nothing, he drew it as a star. They forged the first 2 stars that week from a broken wagon axle, and they were ugly and heavy, and Asa said they looked like something off a general's coat. And Boyd allowed that the wall was welcome to feel decorated. He was fitting the second one at the Sowell house, up on the scaffold with the October light coming flat up the street, when Asa whistled from the ground and nodded east. A buggy was coming up from the Leadenham depot at a townsman's trot, and the man driving it wore a city hat, and on the seat beside him rode a surveyor's level in its box. Word had been ahead of him for 3 days. The county building committee, shamed by a Charleston paper into doing something about its dangerous walls before winter, had sent for a professional to walk the town and pronounce. His name was D.W. Latta. He had put up brick buildings in 3 states, and in a county that had spent 6 weeks laughing at a blacksmith. He was about to say the one thing Boyd had no iron for. He was going to agree with the county. D.W. Latta spent 2 days in Leadenham before he said anything at all, and the town cal gave him room because he worked the way men trust. He did not talk. He measured. He set his level in the street and turned it on wall after wall and wrote in a stiff-backed book, and he went into the condemned kind of buildings the salvage men would not enter without whistling, and he came out writing. On the 3rd evening the building committee took the schoolhouse, lit both lamps, and 40-some citizens of Ashby County came to hear a professional tell them what their town was worth. It took him 11 minutes. 7 of Leadenham's brick buildings, he said, could not be made safe by any means he was prepared to certify. Among them the Averett store, whose whole street gable stood a hand's width out of plumb, and the old bank, whose trouble was not the crack you could see but the bearing you couldn't. The brick at the base of the wall crushed to meal under its own weight. Those 7 he recommended vacated by the 1st of December and taken down before spring. Taken down, he did not need to add, by the men already in town offering $4 a thousand. Then, because he was thorough, and because the whole room was waiting for it, he turned to the matter of the blacksmith. He had examined the rotted houses, he said. He would say 3 things, and he would say them to Mr. McElveen's face, which was in the 3rd row and did not move. First, iron in a wall cannot be inspected. A committee certifying a building certifies what it can see, and what Mr. McElveen had done lived inside the attic and inside the brick. I am not asked to certify his iron, Latta said. I am asked to certify his judgment. No responsible man signs that. Second, a rod mends a pull. It does not mend a crush. The bank's trouble was crushing, and every rod in South Carolina drawn to the breaking would not put the marrow back in that brick. Anyone telling the county that iron cured cracked buildings, all cracked buildings, was selling something. And third, he said it plainly without heat, which made it worse. There was no number behind any of it. No test, no table, no precedent he could cite. The gentleman has a feel for iron, I do not doubt it. But a county cannot stand its children on a feel. The room turned to Boyd, who stood up slowly, and the county learned something about him that evening that it had somehow missed in 34 years, which is that he did not argue like a man on a porch. He argued like a man in a shop where a thing is so or it is not. Mr. Latta's right twice, Boyd said. You can't see my iron, and iron don't mend a crush. I looked at that bank the 2nd week of September and never offered to touch it. And Marsh Averett will tell you I turned his store down flat. Them 2 are dead, and the honest trade for dead brick is $4 a thousand. He let that sit a breath. But he's counting wrong on the third one. He says there's no test behind the rods. There's 100 years of it. Every vessel that clears Charleston bar is the test, run daily. The sea has been trying to pull ships into boards since before this county had a name, and the ships come back, and they come back because they're sewn. He picked his hat off the bench. The ground will grade us all directly. I ain't in a hurry. It was the longest speech anyone in Lebanon ever heard him make, and it changed no votes. The committee adopted Latta's report entire. The 7 were posted. Greer's crew signed the Averitt store and the bank and set the last week of October to begin. And 4 of the other 5 owners, staring down December, took the salvage terms inside a fortnight. Boyd lost more than the argument. The Marchbanks house, the biggest rotting job he had lined up, and the one that would have carried the forge through winter, was on the posted list, and the Marchbanks signed with Greer on a Tuesday and would not meet his eye at church. That was the third failure, the one with no iron in it, and it was the heaviest. A man can reforge a rod. He cannot reforge a committee. So Boyd did the only thing left, which was work. Through the first 3 weeks of October, he and Asa rodded what the county would still let them touch. Houses whose owners were too stubborn, too fond of the Blacksmith to sign anything. They drew up the Herndon place and both Coker houses. They replated the Sowell wall on the big stars and drew it sound. They did the Cutchin store for a winter of credit, and the Ruffin house for a shoat and a wagon of lightwood. By the 21st of October, there were 11 buildings in and around Lebanon, wearing what the county had learned to call, with a smile, the corset. 11 roofs worth of families sleeping behind rotted brick, most of them a little ashamed of it in daylight. And there was chalk on the Averitt gable, where Greer's men would start their bars on Monday. On the night of the 21st, Boyd banked his fire late, and as he stood hanging the rake, the horseshoes on the north wall began very softly to chime. He did not move for a moment. Then he crossed the yard, woke Asa, and the 2 of them dressed and sat in the open door of the forge in the cold, the boy wrapped in a horse blanket, and waited on the ground the way you wait on weather. The shoes rang and quit and rang. Toward first light the water in the slack tub wrinkled, edge to center. "Here it comes," Boyd said, and put his hand flat on the doorpost, and the earth under Ashby County drew its breath and asked its question again. It was not the monster of August. The papers would call it a severe aftershock, one of the pair that struck that Friday and rattled the Low Country's nerve all over again, just as it had begun to heal. In Lebanon it lasted the length of a long-held note. It was strong enough to fling every loose thing off every shelf in town, strong enough to finish 40-odd chimneys across the county that August had left half-killed, and strong enough, a few minutes past dawn, to lay the whole chalked gable of the Averitt store down into the empty street in one piece, where it broke across the hitching rail with a sound men heard from their barns 2 miles out. Nobody was under it. Monday's crowbars had been beaten by 3 days, and then the sun came up properly, and Lebanon walked out into its streets and counted. And the counting is the part of this story that was told in that county for 50 years. The Averitt gable lay in the street. The bank had shed its cornice and sat visibly lower on its crushed corner, done even for salvage brick. Up and down the 4 streets, the unrotted cracks of August had all moved. Men who had sighted along their walls for 6 weeks could see the new daylight in them. And 3 more houses that had escaped the posted list in September walked onto it that morning by themselves. The 11 corseted buildings stood. Not one of the 11 showed a new through crack. Not one had shed so much as a plate. At the Pruitt house, the crowd was thickest, because everyone knew that Gable was the first and the worst. And Orrie Pruitt stood on her porch in her Sunday shawl on a Friday, and received the town like a bride's mother. And the star on her wall sat exactly where Boyd had drawn it, holding in the flat morning light. Latta was in town. He had come up the evening before to see the teardown begun. He walked the 4 streets that morning with his level and his stiff-backed book, and he took his time, and the town let him have it, trailing him at a respectful 30 feet like men, following a verdict. At the Pruitt house he set the level, sighted the wall he had sighted 3 weeks before, and stood looking at his own figures for a while. Then he closed the book on his thumb and said, to the street at large, in the voice of a man reading off a scale, 11 up, 11 standing. He looked at his book once more. I have signed my name to buildings I trusted less. That was the whole speech, and it was enough, because of what he did with the rest of the day. He did not leave. He took a room over Cutchin's store, and by lamp that night he rewrote his report to the committee, and the new report said what the old one said about the bank and the Averett store. Dead is dead, iron mends no crush. And then it said that every other posted building in Lebanon was to be offered before any salvage contract executed. The remedy of through rods and anchor plates after the pattern of B. McElveen Smith of this county, installed under Mr. McElveen's hand, and that the undersigned would certify the work. He drew the star on the last page himself with its dimensions, and titled the sheet the McElveen pattern. And when the committee adopted the new report on the first Tuesday of November, the 4 owners who had signed with Grier tore up their terms inside the week, and Grier, to his credit, let them, and took his crew back down to Charleston with the only 2 buildings in Lebanon that iron honestly could not save. Somebody at the schoolhouse that Tuesday. The accounts disagree on who. Asked Boyd the question the whole county had been circling since dawn on the 22nd. How he had known, back in September, in front of everybody, that it would hold. I didn't know it that morning, Boyd said. I knew it 40 years ago. Every ship in Charleston Harbor is a house in a permanent earthquake. I served my time on the ones that lived. And Verd Talon, who had a crack over his own store window that had grown a foot since August, and a gift for reading which way a county's wind was setting, waited for the laugh to settle, and then said, loudly enough to be quoted, which was the point, Boyd, when you get a minute, come lace one on mine. That winter, the forge at the crossroads burned late for the first time in its history. Boyd and Asa forged stars through November and December. Stars and crescents and plain crossed bars where an owner was too proud for stars, and drew up the posted houses one by one under Latta's signed certificate, and did Talon's store last of all, for cash money at top price, at Talon's own loud insistence, because Talon understood better than anyone in the county what his porch had given Boyd for free and meant to square it. The word corset never left. It flipped. By spring, men from the next county over were driving to Lebanon to see the houses that wore the corset, and saying it the way you say a thing you wish your own town had. And a man with a cracked wall in that country did not ask after tie rods or anchor plates. He asked who could lace him up. They came from 2 counties, then from 4. Asa's hands, which had spent the autumn learning to upset a rod end and dress a star, spent the next 10 years doing little else. And they were not alone. And this story would be smaller than the truth if it claimed they were. Down in Charleston that same autumn, the city was sewing itself back together on the same old shipborne sense. Thousands of rods drawn through thousands of walls, plates and stars and bolt heads blooming on the brick of whole streets, where a great many of them sit to this day. The Pine Flats did not invent the stitch, but Ashby County liked to say, and said it for 50 years, that it was the first place in South Carolina where the stitch had to whip a committee before it was allowed to whip an earthquake. 20 years is a long time in a small town, and it is also nothing at all. On a warm morning in April of 1906, the northbound train dropped the Charleston papers at the Lebanon depot, and by dinnertime Talon's porch, an older porch now, under an older Talon, had read them aloud twice. A city on the far coast of the country had been thrown down in the dark and was burning. San Francisco. Men who had stood in their night clothes in the moonlight of 1886 read the accounts with their lips pressed thin and did not say much, because there was nothing to say that their own walls had not already said. A notions drummer off that same train, walking up from the depot with his sample cases, stopped in front of the Pruitt house. Ori was 83 that spring, and still received callers on the porch, and still called the wall Dandridge's wall. And the drummer set his cases down and considered the black iron star on the whitewashed gable, and asked the girl skipping rope in the side yard what the stars on the houses here were for. Decoration, the girl said, and went on skipping. The drummer nodded and picked up his cases, satisfied, and at the forge at the crossroads, Asa's forge now, in every way that mattered, though a white-headed man of 77 still kept a chair by the door and opinions on everything that crossed the anvil. Nobody would have corrected either one of them, because that is where good repairs go, in the end. They retire into ornament. The corset became a star, and the star became a decoration, and the children of the children who had slept behind rotted brick grew up believing the iron on their houses was jewelry. The way you grow up believing the bridge you cross every morning is scenery. A wall that keeps every promise is a wall nobody remembers made one. The proof that a thing worked, kept working, is that a town gets to forget it, and the forgetting is not ingratitude. The forgetting is the payment. It is what all that iron was for. 50 years of nights when nobody in Leadenham lay awake listening to the ground, in houses stitched shut by a man the county, trusted with nothing above the height of a horse, who had learned from the sea the one thing the land thought it would never need to know. The horseshoes at the Crossroads Forge hang on the same rod to this day of our story, open end down. Now and then on some still night, they ring a little the way iron will, and nobody gets up. This story, like every story on this channel, is true-to-life fiction. The earthquake of 1886 was real, the aftershocks were real, and the iron stitching on old low-country walls is real and still holding. But Leadenham, Ashby County, and every soul in them live only in this telling,